For 12 years she disappeared, burying her Top Gun past in silence. At the airshow, they mocked her, said she was nothing, said she didn't belong. Then an F-22 screamed a desperate SOS, spinning toward disaster. Through the chaos she stepped forward, eyes locked on the sky, and when she rolled up her sleeve, gasps tore through the room. There it was, burned into her skin, the tattoo only Top Gun legends carried. The jeers died instantly, replaced by silence and fear. Seconds later, she was back in the cockpit, the Raptor screaming into the clouds. Two jets, one crippled and one guiding, danced on the edge of fire. Would she bring him home or fall with him in flames? This is VeteranBiker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The air over St. Helena shimmered in the heat of late morning, a restless sky above the wide coastal field where the annual Airshow gathered its crowd. Children waved miniature flags, vendors shouted over one another, and the sharp roar of engines rolled like thunder across the shoreline. It was meant to be a celebration of speed and precision, a spectacle where the crowd could look up and forget their ordinary lives for a while. Yet in one corner of that restless gathering, a woman stood alone, her gaze never leaving the horizon. Madison Cole had lived in that small town for more than a decade, her presence unremarkable, her name rarely spoken. She avoided questions, avoided conversations, and when people pressed too close, she would simply smile politely and drift away. To most, she was a quiet local, someone who kept to herself and nothing more. None of them knew that the silence around her was deliberate, that behind it lay a history once whispered in briefing rooms and flight decks, a name once painted in the memory of those who flew beside her. Raven, they had called her, and to a select few the sound of that word carried weight. But here she was simply Madison, another face in the crowd. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers, describing maneuvers and rattling off statistics, but Madison barely heard him, her focus locked on the glint of wings slicing through the sun, the precise roll of a jet banking over the ocean. The rhythm of it struck something deep inside her, an echo of muscle memory she had fought to bury. For 12 years she had resisted the pull, teaching herself to breathe slowly when the sound of afterburners clawed at her chest, convincing herself she no longer belonged to that world. Yet today felt different. The unease had settled in her bones even before the first engine ignited. Around her the laughter and chatter continued, but the distance was clear. A pair of young men in reflective sunglasses noticed her standing alone and smirked to one another. One raised his voice deliberately, just loud enough to carry. Look at her, staring like she knows anything about jets. Probably thinks this is a tourist ride. His companion chuckled, tossing an empty cup toward a bin and missing completely. Yeah, maybe she's lost. People like that don't belong here. The remark stung, but Madison kept her eyes fixed upward, her expression unreadable. Further along the barrier, a vendor waved a bright shirt like a flag, calling out to anyone who would listen. When his gaze fell on her, he seized the chance for an easy laugh. Hey lady, yoga classes are back in town. Wrong event. The chuckles spread in ripples, a small wave of derision aimed at someone who chose not to fight back. Madison inhaled slowly, her hand tightening around the keychain in her pocket, its edges pressing into her palm, anchoring her to silence. The noise of the crowd masked the faint whine above, a smaller drone weaving patterns against the sun. It was part of the entertainment, a sideshow while the larger aircraft prepared for their display. Yet something shifted in its motion, an irregular tilt that drew Madison's eyes immediately. The announcer faltered as the drone wobbled, dipping too low, its guidance failing. For a heartbeat, no one else understood what was happening. Then gasps burst out as the machine lurched toward the stands. Parents pulled children close, several people stumbled backward, and panic rippled through the nearest rows. Madison did not move away. She stepped forward, her voice sharp and commanding, cutting through the confusion. "Down! Move back now!" The urgency in her tone startled those nearest, enough to make them react. Bodies dropped low as the drone clipped the edge of a barrier and tumbled across the gravel, sparking harmlessly only feet from where they had stood. The danger passed in seconds, but the impression remained. People glanced at her with wide eyes, murmurs spreading, as if trying to reconcile the calm authority in her voice with the woman they had dismissed only moments earlier. The announcer scrambled to recover, assuring the audience that all was under control, that technical staff were handling it. But a crack had formed in the easy mood of the show, a sliver of unease that no one could ignore. Madison let out a slow breath, her hand slipping back into her pocket, the familiar shape of the keychain grounding her again. She told herself she should leave, that the incident was enough reminder of the life she had abandoned. Yet she stayed. Minutes passed, the hum of anticipation returning as the star attraction prepared. The sleek silhouette of an F-22 Raptor cut across the horizon, sunlight flashing on its surface as it climbed sharply, the crowd erupting in cheers. Madison's chest tightened, a reflex she could not suppress, every movement of the jet pulling on muscle memory buried deep. She followed its arc with unblinking eyes, noting every adjustment, every tremor. Something was wrong. The first sign came with a harsh crack, a sound out of rhythm with the roar of engines. The jet shuddered, tilting unnaturally, a streak of black trailing from its flank. The announcer stammered, his voice cracking through the speakers. Then the radio tower cut in, the young pilot's voice ragged with panic. "Mayday! Mayday! I've lost control!" The crowd erupted into chaos. Shouts of fear cut across the field, people pointing upward, others scrambling to drag children to safety. A man in a baseball cap screamed, "It's going to crash." The words fueled the panic, bodies pressing against one another as they tried to flee. Madison's head snapped upward, her entire body going still, the sound of the pilot's distress hammering through her like a signal meant only for her. Her hand clenched so tight around the keychain that the edges dug into her skin, but she did not feel the pain. She could see the spiral tightening, smoke curling from the wounded aircraft, every second bringing it closer to disaster. Memories roared back, hours of drills, endless nights of practice, voices of instructors demanding precision. For years she had silenced those echoes, but now they surged with clarity. Around her the mockery had not ceased. The young men in sunglasses jeered even louder, their laughter shrill in the mounting panic. "What's she staring at now? Think she's going to fix that jet with magic words?" Another chimed in, voice dripping with scorn. "Bet she doesn't even know what an F-22 is, standing there like she matters." Their cruelty cut sharper than before, but Madison did not look at them. She stepped closer to the barrier, her eyes narrowing, her jaw set. A volunteer in a brightly colored vest spotted her movement and approached, clipboard clutched tight. Her tone was syrupy but edged with disdain. "Excuse me, ma'am, this area is restricted, VIPs and staff only. You're not cleared to be here, are you?" The smirks of those around sharpened, waiting for Madison to back down, to retreat in embarrassment. But she did not retreat. Her voice was low, steady, carrying a weight that silenced the immediate chuckles. "I'm exactly where I need to be." The volunteer faltered, her pen frozen above the page, then stepped back with a mutter about civilians who did not follow rules. Madison's gaze never left the sky. The spiral tightened, the trail of smoke darker now, the pilot's voice breaking over the radio, pleading for guidance. Panic rippled again through the spectators, mothers clutching children, men shouting warnings, others frozen in place. Close by, an older man in a navy cap narrowed his eyes at her, studying her face as if reaching through memory. He leaned toward his companion, his words pitched low but audible. "I heard she tried Top Gun once, couldn't cut it, dropped out early, shame really." His friend nodded with a dismissive grunt. "Figures she doesn't look like she belongs here." Madison heard them but did not turn, her shoulders tightening only slightly before she stepped closer to the runway edge. The atmosphere shifted, tension coiling tighter with each second. Somewhere inside the control tower, alarms wailed, and officers scrambled to respond. On the field below, families abandoned blankets, scattering in frantic rushes toward the exits. But Madison remained still, her eyes following the crippled jet, her posture unyielding. The announcer's voice was gone, swallowed by the roar of confusion. Instead, the command tower speaker boomed across the field, the commanding officer's voice raw with urgency. "Is there anyone here skilled enough to fly a Raptor?" The question echoed over the crowd, hanging heavy, desperate. Silence answered him. No one moved, no one spoke. Eyes darted nervously, searching for a hero who would not appear. And then Madison moved. She stepped over the barrier, her shoes striking the asphalt with purpose. The crowd parted instinctively, startled by the sudden certainty in her stride. People turned to one another in disbelief, muttering, some laughing nervously. A news reporter caught sight of her and gestured frantically to her cameraman. "Get this! Some nobody thinks she's going to save the day." The lens swung toward Madison, capturing every step as she walked toward the control room, her presence drawing more eyes with each moment. Phones raised, whispers turned into murmurs, and still she did not falter. For the first time in 12 years, Madison Cole was moving toward the world she had left behind, and nothing in the crowd's ridicule could stop her. The moment Madison crossed the barrier, whispers turned to gasps. Phones lifted higher, recording every step as though the crowd sensed they were witnessing something unusual. The pilot's voice cracked again through the speakers, trembling, fragmented by static. "Mayday! I can't stabilize, losing altitude." The words sliced through the noise of the crowd. Children clung to their parents. Men shouted directions to no one in particular, and volunteers in bright vests tried to guide people away from the field. Yet all eyes kept flicking back to Madison as she walked with measured steps toward the control tower. The officers inside the tower barked into radios, their faces taut with urgency, their screens lit in warning red. One man slammed a fist against a console, his frustration spilling out. Another yelled for engineers, for emergency crews, for anyone who could buy the pilot more time. And then someone noticed the figure pushing through the press of bodies below. Confusion broke across the room as the cameras streaming live images displayed her face on their monitors. The tall officer in charge narrowed his eyes, sweat shining at his temples. "Who is she? Why is a civilian moving toward us?" he demanded. His aide had no answer, only a nervous shake of the head. Through the window, they watched Madison stride closer, her eyes locked on the sky, the roar of engines pounding above them. Down on the ground, the chaos deepened. A group of young men, already loud before, saw their chance to mock her again. The tallest cupped his hands to amplify his jeer. "Hey, yoga lady, what are you doing, going to wave the jet down?" His companions roared with laughter, their jokes sharp with cruelty. Another added, "She'll crash it worse than it already is, watch and see." Their words carried far, feeding the sneers of others nearby. Still Madison did not break stride, her shoulders squared, her focus unbroken. A journalist in a crisp suit seized the chance to make her own spectacle. She gestured to a cameraman, her tone biting. "Zoom in on her. Nobody thinks she's about to save the world. Folks, you're seeing it here first. A wannabe hero walking into disaster." The microphone trembled in her grip with excitement as the lens tracked Madison's progress. Around them, viewers tuned in on phones, the live stream capturing every second, the internet already flooding with comments. Inside the tower, tension built higher. The commanding officer slammed his palm on the table. "Is there anyone who can take that jet now?" He thundered again, his words echoing across radios and loudspeakers. Once more, silence was the answer. No pilot stepped forward, no hand rose. And then Madison reached the door. A guard tried to block her path, his expression sharp with authority. "Ma'am, you can't be here. This is a restricted zone." Madison's gaze met his, calm but immovable. She spoke with a quiet certainty that made him falter. "I don't have time to argue." Her tone left no room for resistance. The guard hesitated, confused, then stepped aside almost without realizing it. She slipped through the door, the noise of the crowd muffling behind her. The air inside the control room was thick with sweat and tension. Officers moved like pieces on a chessboard, some shouting into radios, others pointing at screens filled with alarming data. The damaged jet lurched on the monitors, fire licking at one wing. The pilot's voice broke again, high with fear. "I can't hold it. I'm going down." Madison stepped into that storm of panic and every head turned. The younger officer, thin and sharp-featured, sneered openly. "What's this? Another civilian distraction? She hasn't touched a cockpit in her life." His words earned a few nervous chuckles from colleagues, desperate to relieve pressure with derision. A technician with fogged glasses leaned toward his companion and muttered loudly enough for her to hear, probably, "Just here for attention. Think she'll be famous on TV." His partner grinned, nodding agreement. The major, with a booming voice, swung around, his lip curling. "She's past her prime. Look at her. Out of the game for years. No way she even remembers the sequence for startup." His scorn rang through the room, feeding the doubts already hanging heavy in the air. Madison absorbed every word without flinching. At the far end of the table stood another man, his shoulders stiff, his jaw clenched tight. His eyes flickered with something more than contempt, recognition. He knew her, though he did not say it. He had faced her years ago in training, had watched her outmaneuver him again and again, leaving him humiliated before instructors who never forgot. That shame had festered, hidden, buried. Now, seeing her here, he masked it with disdain, pretending she was nothing. "She doesn't belong here," he muttered, loud enough to seed doubt. The commander, older and grizzled, looked from one officer to another, torn between desperation and disbelief. He opened his mouth to dismiss her when Madison raised her hand slowly, cutting the argument without words. With deliberate calm, she rolled up her sleeve. Gasps cut through the tension like a blade. Etched into her skin was the mark no one expected. The ink, sharp against the light. The emblem reserved for the select few who had completed the most punishing course. The secret insignia carried only by Top Gun legends. Conversations died mid-breath. Jaws slackened. Even the sneering young officer froze, his voice caught in his throat. The technician who had mocked her stared, his smirk collapsing into silence, and the rival who had known her before felt the blood drain from his face, his old shame exposed for all to see. The commander's eyes locked on the tattoo, recognition dawning. His voice dropped, heavy with reverence. "Raven." The words slipped out almost like a prayer. The silence that followed was absolute, the kind that carries both awe and fear. For the first time, the room remembered there were legends among them, and one had just returned. Madison lowered her arms slowly, her face calm, her gaze never leaving the commander's. "You have no time left," she said evenly. "Open the hangar." The rival officer tried to recover, his tone brittle. "She's been gone for years. Her reflexes are gone. You'll kill them both." But the weight of the room had shifted. Doubt still flickered in eyes, but the authority of the tattoo was undeniable. The commander's decision cut across the protests. Clear the way. Outside, the F-22 screamed as it lost altitude, smoke thickening, the young pilot's voice breaking into sobs. Emergency crews shouted on radios, bracing for impact, while the crowd on the field stood frozen, every gaze fixed on the drama above. News feeds streamed updates, the journalist outside breathless with commentary, the group of mockers silenced as disbelief crept in. Inside, Madison stepped forward, her movements precise, her focus unshakable. The chaos around her seemed to fade, as though the noise dulled against the clarity of her purpose. She no longer heard the mutters of doubt, the hiss of whispered insults. She only heard the cry of the pilot, the scream of engines on the edge of failure, and the memory of years in the sky. The technician at the console swallowed hard, his earlier smirk gone. He whispered, almost reverently, "She's really going to do it." His colleague nodded, pale, unable to find words. The rival officer turned away, hiding his clenched fists, but nothing could erase what had been revealed. The tattoo burned in every mind, undeniable proof that Raven had returned. The commander's voice steadied, louder now, resolute. "Get her to the jet." The order cut through the air, final, irreversible. Men and women moved at once, unlocking doors, signaling the hangar, clearing a path. Madison's steps echoed on the floor as she advanced, the room parting for her. For the first time in 12 years, she was walking back into the fire. Above, the crippled aircraft twisted once more, the pilot's voice breaking into static, the crowd outside screaming in dread. But for Madison, the path was clear. She had buried Raven for 12 years. Now the world had dragged her back, and the sky was waiting. The hangar doors rumbled open, the sound heavy and metallic, shaking the floor beneath the officers who had just cleared the way. Madison walked into the vast space, every stride echoing off steel beams and walls lined with tools. The crew that had been scrambling moments earlier stopped what they were doing, stunned by the sight of her. Some blinked as though uncertain if they were witnessing reality. Others whispered to each other, the name Raven surfacing like a ghost among them. One young mechanic, grease still fresh on his hands, shook his head in disbelief. "This jet's next generation, there's no way she can handle it," he muttered, trying to convince himself more than anyone else. His older partner gave a low grunt, his face carved in skepticism. 12 years out, her reflexes will be stone. She's going to choke under pressure. Their doubts filled the air like smoke, spreading from one face to another, yet no one dared step in her path. The Raptor stood at the center, sleek and coiled with restrained power, its engines quiet for now but promising thunder. Madison's gaze fixed on it, her movements calm but carrying weight. She did not pause to argue with the skeptics, nor did she acknowledge the whispers swirling behind her. She simply placed her hand against the cold surface of the jet, as if reacquainting herself with an old companion. At the edge of the hangar, a young recruit clutched his helmet, his knuckles white. He had been among those who had dismissed her earlier, his voice one of the loudest in the room. Now he stared as she adjusted her gloves, his throat dry. He muttered to the soldier beside him, "If she fails, that kid dies with her." The words echoed in the quiet, and several eyes dropped to the floor. Madison climbed into the cockpit with practiced ease, her body moving as though the years had never passed. Her hands traced over controls with familiarity, each gesture efficient, each touch precise. She adjusted straps, pulled them tight, and glanced upward through the canopy, her eyes narrowing as the burning jet carved another desperate loop above. From the control room, a dozen voices barked updates. Alarms shrieked, and the young pilot's terrified pleas reached her headset. "I can't keep it steady. I'm losing altitude fast." Madison's reply came calm, clear and direct. "Listen to me. You're not alone. Match my moves and I'll bring you home." The hangar team listened, their skepticism shaken. They had expected nerves, hesitation, maybe even fear. Instead, her voice radiated steadiness, the tone of someone who had been forged in countless drills and missions. Some of them looked at each other, the doubt on their faces thinning, replaced with something closer to reluctant belief. Meanwhile, at the far wall of the hangar, an older woman with a lanyard across her neck crossed her arms and scoffed loudly. "That's her? They're letting her fly? She looks like she'd faint if she cut her finger." A younger colleague laughed nervously, though the sound carried little conviction. "Yeah, this is going to be a mistake, you'll see." Madison heard them but did not turn. Her fingers tightened the last strap, her jaw set, and she focused on the instruments before her. Engines roared to life, the vibration rattling through the hangar, making loose tools tremble on their shelves. The crew covered their ears, eyes wide as the jet rolled forward, guided toward the runway by signalers who waved glowing batons. Madison's grip on the throttle was steady, her mind quiet in the face of surrounding noise. She had flown through worse storms than ridicule, and nothing outside the canopy mattered now. The Raptor rolled across the tarmac, building momentum, the heat from its engines rippling across the ground. Spectators pressed against barriers, the earlier jeers gone, replaced by stunned silence as the jet accelerated. The crippled F-22 above dipped lower, smoke trailing heavy, its pilot gasping for breath as he tried to keep the machine in the air. The contrast was stark, one bird falling, the other rising to meet it. The instant Madison lifted off, the field erupted in wind and noise, the ground shrinking beneath her as she surged into the sky. The plane responded as though it had been waiting for her, each adjustment sharp and true, each command flowing with muscle memory. She felt the weight press her into the seat, but her eyes never wavered, her focus pinned on the burning aircraft ahead. On the runway, emergency vehicles idled, their crews braced for catastrophe. Medics tightened straps on stretchers, their faces tense, prepared to rush forward at the first sign of impact. One medic muttered to her partner, "She's going to crash, and we'll be cleaning up pieces." The younger woman beside her nodded stiffly, though her eyes betrayed unease. "Still, if she pulls it off, I'll eat my kit." In the control tower, the commander leaned forward, knuckles pressed to the table, watching the two blips on the radar draw closer together. The rival officer, who had once known her, paced with clenched fists, his expression tight with anger masked as concern. "She won't make it," he said, his voice brittle, "and when she fails, remember who warned you." The commander did not answer. His eyes remained locked on the screens, his jaw set, hope warring with doubt. As Madison closed in, the young pilot's voice cracked again, heavy with panic. "I can't. It's burning bad. Controls are sluggish." She cut through his fear with command. "You can. Focus on my wing. Follow me step for step." Her words were firm but carried a rhythm meant to steady him, each instruction simple, each order a lifeline. The crowd below held its breath, hundreds of eyes tracking the jets as they circled. The journalist with the microphone, once mocking, now whispered to her cameraman, her voice trembling, She's actually doing it." The cameraman zoomed closer, capturing the two aircraft weaving together, one guiding the other through a deadly dance against gravity and flame. Every turn tightened the knot of suspense, every second stretching longer than the last. The crippled jet wobbled, sparks scattering from its wingtip, yet it remained beside Madison's Raptor, holding formation by sheer will and her unwavering guidance. Onlookers who had once laughed now stood in stunned silence, some clutching their phones but forgetting to record, others frozen with hands to their mouths. In the hangar, the young recruit who had doubted her most leaned forward, his helmet slipping from his grip, forgotten. His voice was barely a whisper, carried only to the soldier next to him. "She's keeping him alive." His comrade nodded, eyes wide, no words left to speak. Above, the sky seemed to shrink around the two jets, the crippled bird dragging smoke like a wound, while Madison's craft shadowed it with precision. She adjusted, corrected, coaxed, her commands flowing like steady waves over the radio. The pilot's breathing steadied, his responses clearer now, his voice trembling but anchored by her. The rival officer in the tower turned away from the screens, unwilling to watch the possibility of her success. He pressed his hands against the window frame, sweat at his brow, muttering curses under his breath. Every second she held the line chipped at his pride, exposed the lie he had clung to for years. He had told himself she was finished, that Raven was gone. Yet here she was, defying the sky itself. As the minutes stretched, the world below grew quieter, the chaos subdued by awe. Even the jeering group at the barrier had fallen silent, their sunglasses reflecting the sky they no longer dared laugh at. Somewhere among the spectators, a school group watched with wide eyes, one teenager raising his phone high to record. His voice, once smug, now quivered with something else. She's flying with him, keeping him alive." Madison did not hear their words. She only heard the engines, the alarms, and the voice in her headset that no longer sounded alone. The descent toward the runway had not yet begun, but already the shape of what was coming pressed down on everyone watching. A decision loomed. A test that would decide if Raven truly belonged to legend, or if she would be remembered only as a ghost who tried and failed. And as the jets circled together, the field below stood utterly still, every soul caught in the weight of a woman who had stepped from silence into the sky once more. The two jets hung in the sky like a fragile balance, one whole, the other wounded, their paths interwoven as though stitched by invisible thread. On the ground, the silence deepened, the earlier commotion replaced by a collective stillness. People pressed closer to barriers, emergency crews stood braced yet frozen, and even the announcer, once loud and commanding, had lost his words. All attention locked on the impossible sight of Madison's Raptor holding position beside the crippled fighter, guiding it through each agonizing turn. Inside the control tower, the commander's jaw remained tight, his eyes narrowed at the radar. Every small fluctuation drew a murmur from the officers behind him. He heard the intake of breath whenever the damaged craft dipped too low, felt the hush spread when Madison's voice cut across the radio. Her instructions were spare, clear and steady, shaping the young pilot's movements with precision. "Ease the throttle, match me, stay with my wing," she said. Her tone carried no hesitation, no tremor. The kid on the other end stammered an acknowledgement, his breathing shaky, but he followed. The blip on the radar shifted back into alignment. Relief swept through the room, though no one dared speak it aloud. The rival officer stood at the side of the tower, arms crossed so tightly his knuckles paled. He refused to watch the screen too long, instead glaring at Madison's files spread across a table, an old document retrieved in the scramble. He muttered bitterly, his voice low but edged with venom. "She shouldn't be up there." 12 years gone, reflexes dulled, she's gambling with his life. But no one answered. Doubt no longer carried the weight it once did. Down below, medics by the runway clutched their gear. The older one who had scoffed earlier now chewed at her lip, unwilling to tear her eyes from the sky. Her partner leaned forward, whispering, "She's holding him together. He'd be gone already without her." The older medic gave no reply, only tightened her grip on the bag at her side. In the hangar, mechanics who had mocked her before stood in uneasy silence. One rubbed a hand over his face, his earlier words heavy in his throat. Another crossed his arms, watching the monitor that showed the live feed, his voice a faint rasp. "That's control. That's someone who never forgot." None of them laughed now. On the field itself, children clutched small flags tighter. Parents pulled them closer, and strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, bound by the sight overhead. A boy from the school group, who had mocked her earlier, held his phone up high, but his voice was hushed. "She's really keeping him alive," he whispered, as though afraid speaking louder might break the fragile balance. Above them all, Madison focused only on the horizon and the jet beside her. Warning lights flashed in her cockpit, alarms chimed in waves, but her concentration never broke. She had flown through chaos before, had faced storms of fire and steel, and she had learned long ago how to drown out the noise that tried to tear a pilot apart. Her voice carried calm through the comms. "Steady now. Look at me, not at the flames. You follow me, you live." The young pilot's voice cracked but steadied with her rhythm. "Yes, ma'am, I'm on you." He mirrored her bank, his jet wobbling yet recovering. Their wings nearly touched, so close the crowd below gasped as one. To them it looked like a dance on the edge of death, two machines weaving through the sky, one guiding, one clinging to survival. The commander leaned forward, barely breathing as the jets aligned. The younger officer who had sneered earlier wiped sweat from his brow, his smirk gone. He muttered, half to himself, "She's actually doing it." The rival officer snapped his head toward him, fury flashing, but the room no longer cared for his bitterness. All eyes remained on the radar, all ears tuned to the calm female voice guiding a boy back from the edge. Minutes stretched long. The descent loomed inevitable. The damaged jet could not stay in the air much longer. The decision had to come soon, and everyone watching felt the tension coil tighter. The journalist at the barrier, microphone clutched in both hands, spoke in a voice unlike her earlier mocking tone. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you're seeing defies belief. A pilot thought lost to history, now fighting to bring a burning jet home." The cameraman zoomed in, the lens shaking as though even technology felt the weight of the moment. The group of young men who had laughed earlier stood subdued. The tallest rubbed the back of his neck, his grin long vanished. The one with the gold chain kicked at the dirt with his shoe, unwilling to look anyone in the eye. Their mockery had dried up, replaced by shame they could not admit aloud. Up in the cockpit, Madison adjusted her grip, her eyes narrowing as the runway glimmered in the distance. "We're going to start down," she said firmly. "Follow every move, no hesitation. Copy?" The young pilot gave a quick, shaky answer, fear thick in his tone, but he complied. The descent began, slow at first, then faster as gravity pulled hard. Smoke poured from his jet, flames licking brighter at the wounded wing. The crowd below erupted into a mixture of cries and prayers. Some could not bear to watch, turning away. Others locked in place, hands clutched before mouths. The medics gripped their stretchers tighter. The emergency vehicles roared their engines, ready to move the instant disaster struck. The rival officer pressed his hands into the windowsill so hard his fingers whitened. He whispered under his breath, words only he could hear, a desperate mantra that she would fail. But even he could not deny the truth blooming before him. Each second she held him steady was another second his old shame deepened. The commander stood tall, his voice a low growl meant for himself. "Come on, Raven, bring him in." His words carried a strange reverence, a plea wrapped in authority. The officers behind him shifted uneasily, their disbelief slowly reshaping into awe. The jets sank lower, the ground rushing upward. Madison spoke again, firm and unwavering. "Ease into my line. Keep your nose up. Feel the air. Trust me." The boy's breathing rasped through the headset, but he followed, his jet wobbling yet correcting as she adjusted ahead of him. Their wings aligned once more, impossibly close, the two Raptors sliding together through the sky. The crowd had no sound left, only the thunder of engines filling the air. Children buried their faces against parents. Veterans in the crowd clenched fists against their hearts. Strangers held each other's arms. No one had room left for doubt. Madison's eyes fixed on the runway. Every calculation from her past returned with sharp clarity. Every instinct honed from years she had tried to bury. She had hidden Raven for 12 years, but Raven had never left her. Now the world was watching, and there was no turning back. The wheels lowered, the descent sharpening, the crippled jet threatening to tip. Madison barked a final command, voice cutting like steel. "Now, pull left with me." The boy obeyed, his craft lurching but holding, their paths locked as though tethered by fate. The field below braced, the emergency crew surging forward, the crowd clutching each other, the officers silent in the tower. In that suspended instant, the outcome teetered, a heartbeat away from triumph or disaster. And then the jets touched Earth. Madison's Raptor landed first, tires screeching against asphalt, smoke curling from the strain, the machine skidding but holding the line. The wounded fighter followed, sparks erupting from its landing gear, flames spitting but not consuming. Both roared down the runway, slowing, fighting against momentum until they rolled to a stop amid sirens and foam spraying from rushing trucks. The crowd exploded in a sound that was neither cheer nor cry, but a raw roar of emotion. Relief, disbelief, awe, all mixed together in a single wave that shook the field. Phones flew upward, people shouted each other's names, some fell to their knees, others simply wept. The announcer finally found his voice, but it cracked with emotion. "They're down, both are down. Against all odds, they made it." Madison exhaled, her grip loosening on the controls. For a moment she allowed her eyes to close, the weight of the world falling from her shoulders. Then she unstrapped, her movements deliberate, steady, though her body trembled beneath the calm. Outside, fire crews sprayed the crippled jet. Medics rushed the young pilot who stumbled from the cockpit, his face pale, his suit singed, his eyes wide with something like reverence. He turned toward Madison's craft, searching for the woman whose voice had carried him through fire. The crowd's roar faded into a hush as Madison climbed out of her Raptor. She dropped to the runway, her knees unsteady, her body drained. Still she stood tall, her eyes scanning the scene, the flames, the foam, the boy being guided away. She had kept him alive. That truth rang louder than any cheer, and as the silence pressed close again, every face turned toward her. Those who had mocked fell quiet. Those who had doubted lowered their heads, and those who had whispered shame now found themselves speechless. Raven had returned, and the sky had listened. The runway steamed with chemical foam, fire crews dousing the last tongues of flame licking from the wounded jet. Sirens still wailed, but the immediate danger had passed. The young pilot sat slumped on the tarmac, medics surrounding him, his helmet off, hair damp with sweat. He struggled to find words, his chest heaving as he searched the sky as though still expecting it to collapse upon him. His eyes locked on the woman stepping down from her Raptor, and his lips moved with a sound that carried no further than his own ears, a whisper of thanks meant for her alone. Madison's boots struck the asphalt lightly, her body weary from the fight above, her muscles trembling from the strain of holding steady for so long. Yet she stood straight, her gaze sweeping the runway and then pausing on the boy she had saved. For a moment she allowed herself to see him safe, his breathing steadier, the fear in his eyes tempered by relief. It was enough. Around her the noise of the crowd shifted into an uneasy blend of cheers and whispers. The eruption of sound that had greeted the landing now faltered as people absorbed what they had seen. Some applauded wildly, their voices rising in raw celebration. Others clapped hesitantly, uncertain if they should treat her as hero or intruder. Many simply stared, phones held high but hands shaking. The earlier jeers had vanished, but in their place lingered the weight of shame. By the barrier, the group of young men who had mocked her most were silent. One dropped his sunglasses, the plastic skidding along the ground, forgotten. Another shoved his hands deep into his pockets, avoiding the eyes of those around him. None dared raise their voice now, not after the impossible had unfolded overhead. The journalist who had taunted her earlier clutched her microphone, her expression twisted between awe and envy. She muttered into the camera, her words softer than before, lacking the mocking edge. She brought them both down alive. The cameraman kept the lens fixed on Madison as though unwilling to look away, sensing the footage would spread far beyond the boundaries of this airfield. In the hangar, mechanics stared at the monitors replaying the landing. One exhaled loudly, shaking his head as though to rid himself of disbelief. "I called her fossilized," he murmured, "but she flew like time hadn't touched her." His colleague nodded mutely, unwilling to meet his eyes, knowing they had been proven wrong. The commander left the control tower and strode across the runway, his steps heavy but resolute. Officers followed at a distance, their faces lined with exhaustion and humility. He stopped a few feet from Madison, his voice carrying just enough for those nearest to hear. "Captain Cole!" he said, the name formal, deliberate, as though acknowledging what could no longer be denied. "You saved him. You saved us all from watching another jet fall from the sky." His words were plain, but behind them lay the weight of recognition. Madison inclined her head slightly, her expression calm though her pulse still hammered. She did not bask in the words, nor did she dismiss them. She let them stand as they were, truth needing no flourish. From the crowd a ripple of motion began, a murmur spreading as people stepped aside to let her pass. No one jeered now, no one dared. She walked slowly, exhaustion making her legs heavy, yet her presence carried the quiet authority of one who had faced fire and returned. At the far edge of the crowd, a girl in flight school uniform clutched her phone tightly, the recording light still glowing. She had captured every second of the impossible rescue, her eyes wide with tears she refused to let fall. To her, the footage was more than proof, it was revelation. She had grown up hearing fragments of the legend of Raven, a name half buried in rumor, a ghost story whispered in hangars. Now she had seen Raven with her own eyes, and her camera had preserved it. She pressed the stop button gently, almost reverently, and held the phone against her chest as though safeguarding a relic. Emergency crews finished tending to the young pilot, lifting him carefully to a stretcher. His eyes never left Madison, his gratitude etched in silence. He reached out a hand, not to grasp but to acknowledge, a gesture clumsy yet sincere. Madison gave a small nod, her features softening just enough for him to see. Then she turned back toward the command staff. The rival officer, his face pale with humiliation, tried to mask his bitterness. He forced his words through clenched teeth, each syllable sharp. "This doesn't prove anything. One lucky landing after 12 years doesn't change the fact she is out of practice." His voice carried farther than he intended, drawing sharp glances from those around him. The commander's eyes hardened, his tone cutting as he replied, "It proves everything that matters. She kept him alive when no one else could." The rival shrank back, his pride burning in silence. The young recruit who had doubted her earlier approached cautiously, his helmet tucked under his arm. He stopped a few feet away, his posture stiff with shame, his voice cracked as he spoke. "Ma'am, I was wrong." He swallowed, his eyes dropping to the ground. "I said you'd fail. I said you'd kill him, but you didn't. I'm sorry." The words were awkward, halting, but the sincerity behind them was unmistakable. Madison studied him for a long moment, then gave a single nod. It was enough. The commander gestured toward the barracks at the edge of the base. "Come with me. You need rest, and the medics will check you. After that, we will speak further." His tone carried both command and respect. Madison hesitated briefly, her eyes sweeping the field one more time, then she followed. As they walked, hundreds of service members formed lines outside the barracks. Pilots in flight suits, ground crew in oil-stained coveralls, Marines in crisp uniforms, all standing shoulder to shoulder. The line stretched farther than she could see, faces solemn, eyes fixed on her. As she drew near, they raised their hands in unison, a salute sharp and unwavering. The sound of boots clicked against pavement, a rhythm that carried weight heavier than any cheer. Madison paused at the doorway, her throat tightening at the sight. For years she had told herself she was forgotten, that her name had been buried, that silence was the only shield she had left. Yet here stood 500 men and women, saluting not a ghost, not a rumor, but her. The rival officer stood apart, refusing to lift his hand, his jaw clenched in defiance. But even his refusal could not diminish the gravity of the moment. The salute belonged not to him, nor to the doubters, but to the truth they could not erase. Inside the barracks the air was cooler, quieter, the hum of a fan filling the space. Madison sat on a cot as medics examined her, their hands gentle, their eyes filled with something closer to awe than mere duty. One medic whispered softly to another. She looked death in the face and brought him back. "That's no fossil." The other nodded silently, bandaging a scrape on her arm. Her gaze drifted to the table beside the cot, where a glass of water sat untouched. Next to it rested her sleeve, folded back, the tattoo visible stark against her skin. She traced it lightly with her fingers, not as display, but as reminder. She had hidden it for 12 years, covering it as if it no longer mattered. Now it had spoken louder than any word, a mark that could not be erased by time or ridicule. The commander entered quietly, closing the door behind him. His face softened, his voice steady but lower than before. "You saved a life today. You saved this base from watching a disaster unfold. Whatever you think of yourself, you are still one of us." Madison met his eyes, her own steady, her voice calm. "I did what had to be done." He inclined his head, accepting the answer. Behind him the hallway was crowded with pilots and Marines, still standing at attention. Their respect filled the air like a tide, undeniable, inescapable. Madison rose slowly, fatigue heavy in her body but her back straight. She stepped to the doorway, and the formation snapped tighter, hands lifting again in salute. She looked at them, her silence louder than words. They had mocked, doubted, dismissed, but now they stood for her. Some faces burned with shame, others with pride, all united in acknowledgement. She did not smile, did not wave. She simply stood, the presence of Raven enough. As she turned away, the coastal breeze drifted through the open barracks window, In the distance, another jet took off, its roar carrying across the base. Madison paused, listening, her eyes lifting once more to the sky. For 12 years she had hidden, but the sky had not forgotten her name. The base had quieted after the chaos, but the air still carried the weight of what had happened. Conversations that normally filled the hangars and walkways were subdued, every voice lowered as though people feared disturbing the memory of the landing. Even the sound of tools clinking in workshops was softer, each mechanic working with a distracted rhythm, glancing skyward as if the spectacle might repeat itself at any moment. Madison remained in the barracks, sitting on the edge of the cot where the medics had left her. She had been urged to rest, to drink, to let her body recover, but stillness was never easy. The adrenaline had drained from her veins, leaving behind exhaustion that pressed heavy on her limbs, yet her thoughts refused to quiet. She stared at her arm, at the tattoo that had once been her burden and had now become her proof. For years she had hidden it beneath sleeves, unwilling to let anyone see, unwilling even to look at it herself. Now it had been revealed before 100 eyes, and no one could deny what it meant. A knock sounded at the door. The commander stepped inside, his uniform jacket removed, his face marked with lines of fatigue. He did not bark orders or speak with the clipped tone of authority. He simply lowered himself into the chair across from her and exhaled. "They are still outside," he said quietly. "The pilots, the Marines, the crew. They refuse to stand down until you acknowledge them." Madison's gaze flicked toward the door, then back to him. Her voice was even. "They already know the truth. That should be enough." He studied her for a long moment, then leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "Do you think silence protects you? Do you think hiding what you are will keep you safe? You saw the boy you guided today. He would be gone if not for you. The sky does not care for your years away. It still remembers you." His tone carried no accusation, only conviction. Before she could respond, a murmur rose outside the barracks, the sound of boots scuffing against pavement, the creak of rifles shifting, the collective movement of hundreds holding formation. Madison stood, her legs unsteady but her back straight. She opened the door and stepped into the threshold. The sight stopped her breath. The formation stretched down the length of the street, rows of uniforms sharp in the sunlight. 500 men and women stood motionless, salutes raised, eyes locked on her. Not one voice broke the silence. The rival officer who had sneered earlier was nowhere to be seen, his absence a statement in itself. The younger officer who had doubted her stood rigid, his salute crisp, his earlier smirk erased. Even the mechanics who had scoffed lined the edges, their postures stiff, their shame written in their faces. Madison scanned their ranks, her silence as deliberate as her steps. She did not raise a hand in return, did not seek to claim their gesture for herself. She simply stood there, her presence alone enough. The commander came to her side, his voice low but carrying. "They stand for you, Raven. You do not need to answer. But know this, they will not forget." One young Marine near the front swallowed hard before speaking, his voice trembling but audible. "Ma'am, I was wrong. We were wrong." His eyes darted to the ground. "You saved him, and I doubted you. Forgive me." Madison's eyes lingered on him for a heartbeat. Then she inclined her head slightly. It was not forgiveness in words, but it was acknowledgement. The boy blinked rapidly, his hand tightening on the salute as though it steadied him. The commander signaled the formation to stand down, and slowly the salutes lowered, the lines dispersing with solemn respect. Madison stepped back inside the barracks, the door closing softly behind her. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of silence, not as exile, but as recognition. The tattoo on her arm no longer felt like a secret to be hidden, but a truth the world had seen and understood. Later, as the sun dipped lower, she found herself walking along the edge of the runway. The foam had dried, leaving dark stains across the asphalt. The crippled jet had been towed away, its wreckage hidden in a hangar, but the memory of smoke and fire still lingered in the air. She paused, listening to the breeze sweep in from the ocean, carrying with it the distant roar of another jet climbing high. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the sound wash over her. For 12 years she had told herself she was no longer part of that world, that silence was safer, that anonymity was protection. But the truth had carved itself across the sky today. She had returned because she had no choice. And in doing so, she had reminded them all who Raven truly was. The commander approached from behind, his footsteps steady. "The boy you saved is asking for you," he said. Madison turned slightly, her expression unreadable. "He doesn't need me now, he needs time to heal." The commander shook his head. "He says he needs to thank you himself, face to face. He won't rest until he does." She considered this for a moment, then gave a quiet nod. Together they walked back toward the infirmary, where the young pilot sat propped on a bed, his face pale but his eyes clear. When he saw her, he tried to stand, but she raised a hand gently to stop him. "You did well," she said simply. His throat worked as he tried to speak. "I would have died. You didn't let me. I don't know how to—" His voice broke. Madison's gaze softened. "Live. That is thanks enough." He lowered his head, tears burning his eyes, and she turned to leave before the weight of gratitude became heavier than she could carry. Outside, the evening light painted the base in hues of gold. Madison paused once more, her gaze drifting to the horizon. The sky stretched endless before her, the same sky she had once ruled, the same sky she had abandoned, the same sky that had dragged her back. She knew this was not an ending. It was the start of a reckoning long delayed. For 12 years she had hidden. Today the world had seen her. Tomorrow it would remember. Night had not yet fallen, but the sky carried the darker shade of late evening. Floodlights lit the base, throwing long beams across the runway, where hours earlier fire and smoke had ruled. Crews worked tirelessly to move equipment back into order, their voices low, their eyes glancing often toward the barracks where Madison rested. No one said her name aloud, yet the weight of it hung in every corner. The commander gathered his senior officers in the tower for a debrief. Charts spread across the table, reports piled high, but every conversation circled back to the same truth. One woman had stepped into the chaos, and her presence had changed everything. Some officers admitted it openly, their words edged with awe. Others kept silent, unwilling to acknowledge what they had seen, but their silence was admission enough. The rival officer sat stiff in his chair, his jaw locked, his pride bleeding through clenched fists. He spoke with bitter determination. "You cannot let this stand." She undermined the chain of command, took control without clearance. That is insubordination, not heroism. His voice rose with each word, but the commander silenced him with a look. "She saved a life," the older man replied, his tone flat. "And you would have let him die." The room fell quiet, the rival officer shrinking into his chair, his authority slipping away like sand through fingers. Outside, Madison walked to the edge of the airstrip, her footsteps measured, her thoughts caught between exhaustion and resolve. The tattoo on her arm, revealed before the world, still burned in her mind. It was no longer a secret she could hide. She had become visible again, and with that visibility came weight she had not carried in years. A group of cadets spotted her in the distance. Their voices hushed as they approached, eyes filled with respect they had not shown before. One of them, a young woman with determination etched in her face, stepped forward. She held out her phone, trembling slightly. "I recorded everything. The whole thing. It's already spreading, ma'am. People everywhere are seeing you fly." Madison's eyes flicked to the phone, then to the cadet's face. "The sky doesn't belong to me anymore," she said, her tone steady. "It belongs to those who come after." The cadet's breath caught, her admiration deepening, her voice breaking as she whispered, "But you showed us what it means to belong to it." The words struck Madison more deeply than the applause of any crowd. She nodded once, firm, then turned back toward the hangars. In the control room, the radar still pulsed, showing the patterns of flights beyond the base. Officers moved with renewed caution, the earlier chaos leaving its mark. The younger officer who had mocked her earlier now stood quiet, replaying in his mind the steadiness of her voice, the precision of her commands. His arrogance had crumbled, replaced by reluctant respect. The commander remained at his post, his eyes tired but unwavering. He spoke into the stillness, not to anyone in particular. "She reminded us of what it means to serve. We should not have needed reminding." His words lingered, drawing no reply, but none dared to disagree. Back near the barracks, Madison paused as the evening wind lifted across the base. The sound of jets echoed faintly in the distance, training flights resuming under cautious watch. She closed her eyes briefly, allowing the sound to settle in her chest. For 12 years she had run from it. Tonight it called her by name. The rival officer watched her from afar, anger twisting inside him. He could not erase the image of her steady hands, her unbroken voice, yet he vowed silently that he would not let her hold the spotlight. His pride demanded retaliation, some way to reclaim what he had lost. In his mind, the story was not finished. For Madison, however, the story had already shifted. She had stepped from obscurity into the light of recognition, not because she wanted it, but because the sky had forced her back. She had saved a boy who would never forget, and she had silenced the laughter of those who had dismissed her. Now she faced something even more daunting, the weight of being Raven once more. The base settled into night routines, but whispers continued, weaving through corridors, drifting across the airfield. Every whisper carried her name, some in reverence, some in envy, but all acknowledging the truth. Raven was alive, and the sky had bowed to her return. The celebration that had erupted on the runway began to fade into something quieter, almost reverent. Cheers still echoed, but they no longer held the wild edge of disbelief. Instead, they carried a weight, the sound of people acknowledging what they had just witnessed. Madison stood beside her jet, the metal still hot beneath the fading light, her body heavy with fatigue. Each breath came harder than the last. She looked toward the young pilot surrounded by medics, saw him raise his head to find her, and felt her chest tighten with relief that he was still alive. But as she took a step forward, her knees buckled. The strength that had carried her through the sky drained away all at once. She stumbled and caught herself with one hand against the fuselage, her vision swimming. Shouts rang out. The medics who had been tending to the boy turned and rushed toward her. Madison waved them off, insisting she was fine, but her legs betrayed her. She dropped to the ground, palms scraping against the asphalt, darkness tugging at the edges of her sight. The roar of the crowd silenced instantly. Hundreds of faces watched as the woman who had just pulled off the impossible now lay weakened on the runway. Some gasped. Others pressed their hands over their mouths. The commander broke from the line of officers and sprinted to her side, his expression stripped of command, replaced with concern. He barked orders to the medics, who lifted her carefully onto a stretcher despite her protests. Madison's voice was faint but firm. "I'm fine. Take care of the boy." The words faded as her head tilted back, her eyes closing against the harsh lights overhead. The medics carried her swiftly across the runway, the crowd parting in silence. Phones that had once recorded every moment now lowered, guilt washing over those who had mocked her earlier. Near the barrier, the young men who had laughed stood frozen, their jokes choked in their throats, replaced by shame that burned across their faces. One turned away, unable to look, while another clenched his fists in frustration with himself. Not far away, the woman in the bright dress clutched her purse tightly, her head lowered to avoid the stares of those who remembered her cruel words. The cadet who had filmed everything could no longer hold back her tears. She pressed a hand to her mouth as she watched Madison disappear into the barracks, her camera still in her other hand, recording the stretcher being wheeled away. She whispered to herself, "Don't let this be the end," her voice trembling. Inside the infirmary, the medics moved quickly, attaching monitors, checking her pulse, ensuring her breathing stayed steady. Madison drifted between wakefulness and darkness, the exhaustion overwhelming, yet her expression remained calm even in unconsciousness. The tattoo on her arm, visible where her sleeve had slipped back, caught the light. Several of the staff paused when they saw it, the realization settling deeper. This was not just another pilot, not even just a skilled one. This was someone who had carried the weight of legend. Back outside, the commander faced the crowd. His voice was loud, commanding, yet tinged with something more. "She will recover. She stood for you when no one else would. Remember that." His words spread quickly, whispered from one group to another, reaching even the edges of the field. The young pilot, still weak, insisted on being wheeled closer to the barracks. He wanted to see her, even from a distance, to know she was still there. His gratitude was etched across his features. The memory of her voice guiding him through fire burned into him forever. As night crept in, the base carried a new mood. Shame lingered for those who had doubted, awe for those who had believed too late, and quiet pride for those who finally understood. Madison had saved a life, had silenced ridicule, and had revealed a truth no one could deny. Yet now she lay unconscious, her fate uncertain, and the weight of what she had carried pressed heavy on everyone who had seen her fall. The cadet sat alone near the barracks, reviewing the footage on her phone, the image of the tattoo filling the screen. She wiped her eyes and whispered, "The world will know now. They can't bury her again." And across the base, from the youngest recruit to the oldest veteran, one thought echoed silently. Raven had returned, and the sky would never be the same. Morning broke over the base with a stillness that felt unfamiliar. The chaos of the day before had left its imprint on everyone, and the sunlight seemed almost reluctant to touch the runway where fire and fear had so recently reigned. The barracks doors opened slowly, and Madison stepped outside. She wore plain clothes now, her posture steady though her body still carried the weight of exhaustion. She paused for a moment, letting the cool air brush her face before walking toward the parade ground. She had not asked for ceremony, but it waited for her nonetheless. 500 service members stood in formation, their uniforms sharp, their faces solemn. As she approached, the line rippled into attention, hands snapping up in salute with a sound like thunder rolling across the pavement. The sight stopped her steps. For a long moment she stood still, her eyes sweeping across the ranks of pilots, ground crew, and Marines, each one acknowledging her without hesitation. Among them were those who had doubted her, their faces red with shame. The young recruit who had spoken against her stared straight ahead, his salute firm, unwilling to hide from the truth of his earlier words. The mechanics who had scoffed at her skill stood rigid, their eyes unblinking, refusing to let their embarrassment show. Even the younger officer who had sneered in the tower held his salute. though the tension in his jaw betrayed the sting of consequence. His promotion had already been delayed, his arrogance exposed. The rival officer was absent. Word had already spread that he had been relieved of duty pending review, his long-standing bitterness finally collapsing under the weight of truth. His silence was his sentence, his pride his undoing. Madison did not smile, nor did she bow. She simply lifted her chin slightly, her silence its own answer. She walked slowly past the rows, the sound of boots steady behind her, each soldier holding their salute until she passed. She could feel the shift in the air, the change from ridicule to reverence. Yesterday she had been dismissed as a ghost from the past. Today she was undeniable. The commander stepped forward, his expression firm but his eyes carrying warmth. "Captain Cole," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the ground. "You saved a life, you saved a jet, and you reminded us of what it means to serve with courage. You are still one of us." The words struck deeper than any cheer. Madison inclined her head once in acknowledgement, the gesture enough to seal the moment. At the edge of the formation, the cadet who had recorded the rescue clutched her phone, her eyes bright with pride. The video had already spread beyond the base, carried across networks and screens, watched by thousands who had never heard of Raven before yesterday. To her, the world had already changed. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "They know you now." Madison's gaze swept across the formation one last time, then she turned away. Her steps were measured, her presence quiet yet unshakable. She walked toward the far end of the runway where the coastal breeze lifted, carrying the faint roar of a jet taking off in the distance. The sound reached her like an old friend, familiar and relentless. She stopped, letting the wind brush against her, her hand resting lightly on her arm where the tattoo lay. She traced it once, not to hide, not to regret, but to remember. For 12 years she had buried Raven, convinced the world no longer had a place for her. But the sky had called her back, and in answering, she had proven that time could not erase truth. Behind her the soldiers held their silence, their salutes lowering only after she had gone. In that silence lay an understanding stronger than words. She was not invisible. She had never been invisible. She had only been waiting for the right moment to remind them who she was. Madison kept walking, her figure shrinking against the wide horizon. She did not look back, for she knew she no longer had to. The sky carried her name now, and so did they. The roar of engines has faded, but the echoes of what happened on that airfield will not disappear. Yesterday, a woman the world had dismissed stepped out of silence and faced the impossible. They called her outdated, mocked her presence, said she had no place among them. And yet when fire ripped through the sky, when a young pilot's voice cracked with fear, she answered. Not with promises, not with bravado, but with calm certainty born from years the world had tried to erase. She flew as if time had not touched her, steady hands guiding a crippled jet to safety. She proved that skill, once forged in fire, does not vanish with years in hiding. She reminded us all that courage does not fade, it only waits. And when she walked past 500 service members saluting in unison, the jeers of yesterday turned into silence filled with respect. The rivals who mocked her were left to face the truth of their own weakness, while the legend they had dismissed stood tall once more. Her name does not need banners or headlines. It lives now in the memory of every person who watched the sky that day, in the gratitude of a young pilot who owes his life to her, in the quiet pride of those who finally saw Raven for who she is. If you have ever been overlooked, told you were finished, told you no longer belonged, remember her. You are not invisible. You are not forgotten. This is Veteran Biker. Thank you for standing with us, for sharing this journey, and for keeping these stories alive. Subscribe, leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us for the next chapter already waiting on your screen. The sky remembers those who dare, and so should we.